What's going on, everybody? This is the bonus episode of the Tilt Dynasty Podcast. Another one. The guests have been coming and going here on a regular basis, and we haven't let you down again today. Thankfully, one of the busiest men on the planet when it comes to football and fantasy football in general, in the middle of prepping for rookie drafts and free agents and all that mess, has found his way onto our humble program here. I, of course, am your host with the most time on his hands. I am Thomas Sipple, FF. And fun fact today, the Ravens re-signed one of my favorite players to one of the cheapest deals ever. So welcome back, Big Z.
I'm Billy. You can find me on Twitter at BigBillyFF. My fun fact of the day, DJ Moore, Devontae Adams, and Greg Olsen all have the same number of 1,000-yard seasons since 2014.
Oh my God, that's brutal. And of course, like I said, guests coming in plenty today. The Tilt Dynasty Podcast is joined by Austin Gayle, Associate Director of Content for Pro Football Focus and co-host of the Tailgate Podcast. And like I said, with the draft and everything coming around the corner, we thank you once again for hopping on with the Full Tilt.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I really appreciate having you guys.
Fantastic. So obviously, like we said, busy man, lots to get into. We like to do a quick recap of news because there's so many great shows and people much smarter than most of the people in this room that have already talked about most of these points a couple 100,000 times, especially on the Bird app. So we like to do we care? And I just want to ask, what was the one move made today specifically that made you kind of get up out of your seat, that little bit extra of a lean when you saw it come across your ticker?
I think probably the most impressive move I saw today was Las Vegas Raiders dumping $17.5 million per year into a 3-year contract into Chandler Jones. I think it came out to be $34 million guaranteed to Chandler Jones to really upgrade over Erik Ezukanma. And then, while in the minute or 2 minutes we had, a lot of people said this is a great 3-person rotation, Erik Ezukanma and Max Crosby, and obviously the newly signed Chandler Jones. A couple minutes later, I was like, oh, wait, we're trading Erik Ezukanma to go grab a corner. And I think one is impressive from new leadership from the Las Vegas Raiders, obviously bringing over Dave Ziegler and Josh McDaniels from the Patriots staff to see an opportunity to upgrade at pass rusher, bringing in Chandler Jones, and then an opportunity to go get a cornerback, right? Like Rock Ya-Sin is not a world beater by any means, but it's a Raiders secondary that's desperate for talent in that Patrick Graham defense. He's very similar to another cornerback the Raiders have in Trayvon Mullen. My reaction is that the Raiders are making smart moves, right? Some people are upset that they didn't spend big on day one and get a ton of receiving talent, all that stuff. I think I also saw them sign Mac Hollins, which I think will be a low price move for more special teams, but definitely surprised, or not surprised, but impressed with what the Raiders have done. I think the Chandler Jones signing, in addition to trading for Rock Ya-Sin, I think are two positive moves for this Raiders team.
Yeah, I just the pairing the signing with the acquisition of a corner who graded out at 72.4 in coverage on Pro Football Focus, if I'm not mistaken, is fantastic. The other side of that deal is something I wanted to ask you about. I think Max Crosby's contract is inflated for what he brings to the Raiders. I think getting that steal with Chandler Jones is great. Did you think they overpaid for Max Crosby, or is that?
So I think
I don't
right
see the
now, right now it could look like an overpay, right? Coming off a big monstrous season. He was, however, one of the few edge defenders really in the NFL since 2006 that cleared over 100 pressures. And I think you're getting like a built-in guarantee with his motor and his work ethic. And I don't think it can be understated what sobriety has done for Max Crosby and his ability to add weight and just be a legitimate three-down player, right? I think it's Max Crosby's ascension and like this 1-year wonder status, I do think is rooted in actuality, and that he has like completely changed his frame, completely changed his game. And when he was getting drafted out of Eastern Michigan, he had very similar numbers to who could be the number 1 overall pick, Aiden Hutchinson, right? 3-cone, very similar, very similar athleticism. Like he was a high-tiered athlete. The issue was, and it was the first thing that Mike Mayock said to him on the phone call to Max Crosby, is we need you to add weight. And when he was drinking and all that stuff, it's a lot harder when you're not prioritizing your body with every substance you put in. It can be difficult to add weight. Then he goes sober. I think it was in 2020 of March. And then 2 years later, he's signing this big monster deal. I think it's really impressive. And 2-3 years time, very similar to the Colton Miller deal that the Raiders signed they're going to feel like that's a steal for Max Crosby, in my opinion. I think signing those guys early to where you can get ahead of some market-changing deals at the edge position down the road, I do think the Raiders will benefit from that, both with the Colton Miller deal and then the Max Crosby deal as well.
It's a great look into how to not overreact to a contract signing as we may see it. And you're right, Dave, 100% shout out for doing what he was able to do. And Waller, it so happens they're both on the Raiders. Billy, one big thing that you don't think has been completely beaten to death yet?
I think one of the bigger signings in terms of like goofy, unimportant fantasy, but he's still semi-relevant, from yesterday was J.D. McKissic, and now, of course, we have the same guy going back to Washington. I just think it's like, when we look at that, J.D. McKissic has been extremely productive in his time in Washington. I mean, 2020, he had, I think it was over 100 targets, as he was second to only Alvin Kamara, I think, in 2020. Like, he is a productive player for that team, and he's a great piece of that offense. And if they are really trying to commit to winning right now with Carson Wentz, whether that's a good idea or not, I'm not sure. I mean, having like semi-good players around him is going to be helpful. So I really like the J.D. McKissic going back to Washington. I feel bad for the Bills, but same deal with the Cowboys from yesterday. But just good things all around, I think, for Washington.
My reaction to that, too, is I love the fit for J.D. McKissic and that Buffalo Bills backfield, right? I mean, Zach Moss and Devin Singletary are not good pass-catching backs. Like, they're not coveted for what they do as receivers. So to bring McKissic there would have been a huge lift to that offense. And now coming back, it's like you're going to continue to split snaps and split carries with Antonio Gibson. I think there was a big surge in the fantasy football community around like this free Antonio Gibson kind of commentary. Mm-hmm. J.D. McKissic isn't there to steal some of these targets. So from a fantasy perspective, I think this stinks for Antonio Gibson truthers, but for Washington, they're maintaining or retaining a really good player, one that I think the Bills would have benefited from.
It's a really good real life NFL move, I think. Yeah.
I feel really bad for everyone that smashed J.D. McKissic earlier in best ball drafts and traded second-round picks for him. But I also feel good for the players that went in on Devin Singletary, because right now he's safe. Just hopefully, Cook doesn't find his way drafted by the Bills somewhere in that fourth round come draft day. We're going to take a quick second, Austin, and when we come back, we're going to get into it's the primers and everything else from Pro Football Focus that makes you guys really stand out from everyone else. Here's a clip for everyone watching from our show with Pat Dougherty of NBC Sports Edge. Stay tuned. Speaking of,
we've all been there, man. Like, we've all been in these spots where you're going through life and maybe you've been dating the same kind of girl for a while, but you're like, you know what? Like, I think I can do better. And you're seeing your buddies are with some hot chick. And you keep thinking, like, this is the kind of girl I want. This is the kind of girl I want. And all these end badly, right? And so the Bills, like, they thought that they wanted to bang Zach Moss. And they realized eventually, no, Zach Moss, like, sure, he has those girthy thighs that I appreciate in a cloud of dust. But at the end of the day, Devin Singletary is the one who has a nice little shepherd's pie waiting for me when I get home. Devin Singletary is reliable. And eventually they decided, like, I'm out of the phase where I need to be popping a molly, go into the club and try to hit on some Zach Moss type. I just need to come home with Devin. And I do think that the Bills found themselves a little bit.
Sure hope they found themselves.
It actually, it's funny to me that you look back on a clip like that from last week, just 1 week ago, and here the Bills are trying to find themselves another running back to piece that puzzle. Austin, I want to talk about the Pro Football Focus grades. They are probably one of the most hot button lightning rod topics on the interwebs and the Bird app. And I personally have never seen something be so heavily scrutinized yet at the same time used universally. I've referenced the Pro Football Focus work in articles I've written for offensive linemen because it's just the best tool for it, amongst other things. So we like to introduce some tools. How do you approach film gramming when you're looking at Pro Football Focus grades compared to your own views on players' productions?
Yeah, to kind of level set on PFF grades, I do think how they've been billed, portrayed, or marketed, they've been, or even communicated through some of the talent that we've had at PFF or some of the content creators we've had at PFF, it's been seen as this end all be all, right? For a lot of people say, oh, he's an 86.6. That's the type of player he is. That's how good he is, right? And I think it's been wrongly framed that way. You know, no PFF grade tells you how good a player is. Mm-hmm. It's a new advanced metric to describe a player's production within a game, a season, a series of games, etc. You know, PFF charts every player in every play in every game in the NFL and grades every player on a -2 to +2 scale in an effort to create a more predictive metric than yards per carry, touchdown interception ratio, sacks, tackles, because it's just not good enough, right? I mean, passer rating year-over-year correlation with quarterbacks is so low. You know, yards per attempt so low for running backs. Tackles per game played for linebackers very low. And what we found is, specifically with offensive line and defensive line grades, or quarterback passing grades from a clean pocket, pass rush win rate, a lot of these advanced metrics that we collect, they're more predictive, right? And do they tell you exactly how good a player is? Absolutely not. I don't think anyone at PFF would say that. But what they do is they're more predictive and more descriptive than a lot of traditional metrics, right? I think they're, you know, a player, how many tackles a player gets in a season is nowhere near as descriptive as PFF grade, PFF run defense grade, coverage grade, et cetera. And a quarterback's passer rating is nowhere near as descriptive as PFF grade, right? And you know, where that like specifically shows up in examples is if Aaron Rodgers throws a 60-yard dime on a rope over the top of Davante Adams and he drops it, it's a positively graded play for Aaron Rodgers in PFF system. It's a negatively graded play for Davante Adams. Whereas in passer rating, it's just an incompletion. Like, it's just an incompletion. Davante Adams is not, downgraded. Aaron Rodgers isn't downgraded is downgraded for the dropped incompletion. Like, same with, interceptions that throw to a player's chest, right? Like, you throw an interception to a player's chest, it's an incompletion, your pass rating goes down. But in PFF, it's more significantly downgraded than a throwaway, right? Like, incompletion, I think quarterbacks is really the best description for it. Like, whether you throw the ball away, you throw it right to Von Bell's chest in the peak of the game, or Davante Adams drops it, it's all an incompletion in passer rating, right? It's all an incompletion in completion percentage. And those, when PFF was first founded by Neil Hornsby, he said those data points, those stats aren't good enough. And the same thing with sacks, right? You're going to tell me a defensive end, Khalil Mack, plays 800, 900 snaps a year, and what makes him a good player is the 10 plays he got a sack, or like the 9 plays he got a sack. That, in my opinion, is just not good enough. And like, tackles for loss are maybe better, and then you could add in tackles, and it's this combination of data points that maybe you feel is predictive. But how often is he beating his block? How often is he getting pressure on the quarterback? How often is he winning? Because a sack, if you're coming off the edge, is an unblocked blitzer, gets charted the same way as a sack if you beat 2 men in front of you and drag a quarterback down after putting an offensive lineman on his back. It's not graded the same way at PFF. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. They're nowhere close, and there's so much more area to improve with PFF grading. But what they are trying to do, and I think that's ultimately why there is buy-in. There's only why there's buy-in to PFF is because the data that we have traditionally still isn't good enough. And when we come out of the season and all we can talk about with quarterback play is passer rating, or with receivers, it's yards and receptions, like, it's just not going to be good enough when it's all said and done. And when teams are trying to make decisions like sign a player, trade a player, cut a player, it's oftentimes looking at these data points that can help them, right? Like with Christian Kirk and him signing this monster deal with the Jacksonville Jaguars, he averaged as many yards per out run from the slot last year as Keenan Allen. He ranks top 10 over the last 4 years. And like, those aren't data points like 1,000-yard seasons, but like, they're more even more stable than other data points. So I do think that the reason PFF grades are polarizing is because they've been billed, marketed, portrayed as this end all be all, you're good, you're bad. You're 50.0 versus 80.0. Yeah. Say if, for example, LaDainian Tomlinson in a single game averaged 1.5 yards per carry, is he a bad player? No, but he didn't have a good game. You know what I mean? And you can come out of a game with a 40.0 grade, or even a season with a sub 60.0 grade. Does that make you a bad player? No, but you weren't, grading as well as, maybe we thought, maybe other people think.
It's definitely the most, I feel, diverse set of tools on your website for what you can provide in one place. So that's absolutely great. I have one question to get to before we get Von Miller just signed a ridiculous contract, and I want to ask you about that because I think that's just an unreal contract. But like you said, when teams are releasing players and buying into players, yet they still seem to systematically get things wrong constantly with all this other information that they have access to. Why do you think teams constantly get it wrong? And it seems to be the same teams over and over. Let's take the Jaguars. I heard what you guys mentioned about the Christian Kirk contract and the Zay Jones contract, etc. Why are bad teams still bad when all of this data is quite clearly in front of them?
Honestly, I think it's a handful of reasons, right? I think one is that we overestimate how important it is for these teams to win Super Bowls. I think everyone that analyzes from the 30-foot, 100,000 foot view says they have to make decisions to win Super Bowls. When you can't create a PowerPoint presentation that tells me trading 2 third-round picks for Carson Wentz gets you closer to a Super Bowl. You can't. But what it can do is keep you from bottoming out, right? Yeah. Having Carson Wentz won't let you go like 2-15. You know what I mean? It'll keep you in this middle of the pack. So I do think oftentimes we overrate how much GMs or how much decision makers in front offices are actually making decisions to go win a Super Bowl. Right? Yeah. Because if I'm the Washington Commanders, I'd rather tank and start Dwayne Haskins all year or sign Mitchell Trubisky to play all year than give up the capital to grow Carson Wentz, knowing that I can maybe be in the quarterback market in 2023. But instead, there's obviously interest in not bottoming out, right? And that involves people not losing their jobs and all that stuff. I think the other reason too is that we overestimate. Another thing that we overestimate is how much I had a conversation with someone in Indianapolis at the scouting combine, and he's a scout for a team. I won't say the team. And he said, these scouts at this team put together detailed reports on this is why we want to go draft this player at this spot. And if he's available, I think it makes a ton of sense. And they have this whole scouting department on board. The GM at the top says, not a fan. We're getting this other guy. And when you're making like dictator decisions like that, and it's just one person, one mind who's probably not watching as much tape as these 30 scouts, right? Or GM's watching all this tape. Or GM's looking at all this data. Oftentimes you have to argue, no, they're making business decisions and they're looking at other things. And I think if you get in a situation where GMs are not willing to take bodies of work from other people that work for them and want to make unitarian decisions, you're going to lead to some error, right? It's going to lead to some error for sure. I think you just can't expect Trent Baalke to have as much, did he watch every snap of Christian Kirk last year? I just don't know if that's the case either. But I do think that the primary reason absolutely is that teams are making decisions to save their jobs. They are not making decisions to win a Super Bowl, right? I think me and Mike on our podcast will say, why don't they just tank this year and get the number 1 overall pick and take Bryce Young or take CJ Stroud? It's because if they tank this year, Ron Rivera's fired. If they tank this year, Matt Rule is gone. Matt Rule right now can't afford to lose every game this year. He loses every game this year with Ben McAdoo as OC. He's already had a second OC. This might be it for Matt Rule. So constantly you're seeing teams beg for mediocrity, right? Beg for comfortability and stability in a league where coaches are fired every other year, right? So I do think that's why you do see consistently poor decisions. I think the other part of it too is that there is still an acceptance of analytics, right? You don't take LJ Collier in the first round if you understand the value of interior defensive linemen. You don't take Saquon Barkley in the top 5. If you actually buy into positional value and some of what analytically driven conversation, you're not going to make some of these decisions that they are, but there is still some reluctancy, right? You saw that rant from Dean Pease, the defensive coordinator from the Atlanta Falcons. He said, I still write everything down. These guys are all on computers. I'll tell you what, man, if you're writing things down in 2022, it's not as big of a flex as you think it is. Okay. You are not as efficient as it could be, right? So I do think that part of it is the old age and PFF in its nature, PFF and analytics and this data-driven insights in its nature is competing with traditional thought. You know what I mean? We didn't discover all this new data and collect all these new statistics just to come out of it and say, you guys are doing everything right. All the decisions we've made in the NFL are perfect. Drafting Darren McFadden in the top 5, Saquon Barkley in the top 5, all that makes 100% sense. No, this data has unearthed new decisions and new impact. And guess what? Teams are going forward on 4th down more than they ever have. Teams are not prioritizing running back in the early rounds and not paying them as much. And you're seeing those markets reflect that. So I do think that this wave of data and more predictive data led by companies like Pro Football Focus, Next Gen Stats, Sports Phone Solutions is ultimately improving the game.
Yeah.
Just to avoid the further Ezekiel Elliott type contracts.
Yeah, exactly.
Ooh.
So a couple little pieces of news that came in through here. Von Miller signs a six-year, $120 million contract with the Buffalo Bills. And to a lesser degree, OJ Howard kind of just tagging along, signs a $5 million 1 year. But Von Miller signing through year 38 is...
I'd like to know what the guaranteed money is. I want to know when their out is.
I did see the guaranteed money. It looks like the guaranteed money might only go through like the first 3 or 4 years at a $17.5 million figure. But like $17.5 million for Von Miller and for a Bills team that already has like a lot of investment in the defensive line, I do like that. And it just goes to show, man, how valuable are pass rushers. And I bring up this thing about positional value. It's not some fairy tale, right? Von Miller, who you wouldn't even argue is top 3, top 4 at his position, is getting paid $17.5 million. Hassan Reddick's getting $15-16 million. And if you're going to look at me in the face and draft a defensive tackle or an off-ball linebacker ahead of some pass rushers in the draft, you're just making bad calls, right? You'd rather have the 8th best edge defender in this class than even like the 2nd best off-ball linebacker, because they're just not as expensive on the open market. Teams are begging, paying hand over fist to go get guys that can rush the passer. So spending the high-end draft capital on those guys so you can maximize rookie contracts and all that stuff is such a major part of this, right? Like you have to involve positional value, market value of these positions if you're going to maximize, the game we're playing, right? In the NFL, I've talked about this before too, has done such a good job of gamifying roster building to make it approachable to fans.
Absolutely.
It's why free agency is so huge. It's why the draft is like legitimately one of the biggest things in the calendar year. It's because it's approachable to fans. Fans can understand you get this many picks and this is who you could select. Fans can understand, you get $250 million to run the lemonade stand. How are you going to spend it? And I think that's how the NFL has done a really good job of making it approachable to fans. But now these teams have to play that game, right? It's not as simple as sign good players and draft good players. No, you need to play the game of positional value and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, your positional value shows when you have 6 of the first 7 players in your draft your mock draft that you put at February 21st are offensive tackles and edge rushers. It's clear that that's taking over, and you can find great values like Miles Jack and landing at Pittsburgh for pennies on the dollar when you look at
$1 million.
what they played Schobert last year in Cleveland. Billy?
Yeah, I mean, just going back and tackling, because you mentioned the gamifying of a lot of these moments, and I think one of the biggest things that the biggest clear moments of this gamification is the combine. And you had mentioned that you went out to Indianapolis for the combine. So what is something, because obviously we get to watch this doctor's appointment play out over an entire week. We get to watch the 40-yard dash and everything. But what comes down to something that a person that gets to go there and interact with a lot of these scouts and a lot of these teams, like an additional benefit that doesn't show up on the NFL Network broadcast?
What I'll mention about the combine too, I don't think it's been gamified as much as it's been rightfully positioned to be a media monster, right? The entire scouting combine is sponsored by Verizon. There's a reason it runs from 4 p.m. till 11 p.m. at night. It's so people are watching it when they get home from work, right? It is prioritized for content. And where does that show up negatively for players? I was talking to a trainer that said he was training Boye Mafe, the Minnesota edge defender. He had to wake up at 6 a.m. for a team interview and didn't run his his official 3-cone until 11:30 p.m. That's not optimal testing. It's just not. And what they're doing, asking them to bench press and run agility drills on the same day, do these team things, media, it's turned into so much more of a media spectacle than an actual opportunity to evaluate these players. And that, in my opinion, is such a big concern. When the combine first started, talking to Mike McCartney, who's been an agent in the NFL for, I think, over 20 years. So when the combine first started, it was just an opportunity to get all the players to go in front of the team doctors at once, right? Every team has their own doctor, and there's a lot of players that can get just thrown off boards for certain medical red flags. Then it became, might as well talk to these players and interview these players while they're in town. Okay, might as well have them do a handful of drills. And now it's been turned into this just big, sponsored by Verizon media fest that has honestly harmed the players. And I've talked, every agent I talk to, every trainer I talk to says the combine is a disaster in terms of maximizing that. But in terms of going there and what you can benefit from being in Indianapolis, one, you're bumping elbows with a lot of people who know things, right? And in terms of building out these mock drafts and and talking to them about what trades could go down, who could be going what. Like that Mitchell Trubisky stuff that was going on in Indianapolis was very much real. Like there were teams that are very interested in signing Mitchell Trubisky to this contract. He ultimately felt that the Pittsburgh Steelers were his best opportunity to start. But there were other teams, I think, willing to pay more. Like I think there were teams willing to pay more to him come and compete. But he feels like Pittsburgh was the best area where he could start. So I do think that you gain a lot of information talking to other media, scouts, NFL personnel, and all that stuff. And I think the biggest reason why it's important to teams is the medical checks and the interviews. It's not actually watching them run the 40-yard dash or seeing them run 3 cones at 11:30. They can get that data at private workouts and at pro days, etc. Like teams do not take the combine number as gospel. They take the best number they can get. And oftentimes that is in a private workout where they're able to come in the morning and have just a testing session and all that kind of stuff. So the combine gets the glitz and the glamour for the 40 times and all these thrills. But really what's important is talking to these players in person, letting them shoot mini hoops like Nick Sirianni does, really start to get an idea of what type of human being are you considering drafting.
Yeah. Who's your favorite interview at the combine? If I can get a. Yeah,
that's a good question. I mean, I think Aiden Hutchinson, the Michigan defensive end, is really good. I also came away really impressed with Kayvon Thibodeau. I think Thibodeau has been knocked in this interview process for
that's
being
crazy.
Really confident and being somewhat having like an ego or whatever it may be. But he's just a really confident dude. And he's not just confident in his ability to play football. He's confident in his ability to do anything. And that can come sometimes, rub people the wrong way. You think about, I bring up Dean Pease, and I obviously think he's a fantastic defense coordinator in the NFL, but like Dean Pease talking about how he's upset that people are, still using computers and on their phones. Kayvon Thibodeau has his own cryptocurrency and plays people. He plays people for money in a chess Discord. Is Dean Pease talk about coachability, right? Coachability is something that gets thrown around a lot in the draft process, and people are like, is this guy coachable or not? He's uncoachable, whatever. It's like, no, you just don't know how to coach him, right? There are players that are more coachable through traditional NFL coaches, but Kayvon Thibodeau is not everyone knows how to coach him. Not everyone knows how to approach a Thibodeau, especially in today's NFL. So I do think that you find out a lot about these players and how they're going to fit into the fabric of your locker room.
Yeah. Kayvon Thibodeau's out there minting NFTs.
Can I just ask one more question? Do you think that the fans think the NFL cares more than the NFL actually cares about what happens at the combine? Or do you think that teams generally just look forward to pro days maybe more than they do at combine?
And why do fans think that? Because the NFL loses money if we talk about that more, right? Yeah. Fans need to think it's as important as ever, right? Like, I think if no one watches the combine, if they don't feel like it's all that important to a player's stock or all that important to a player's or a team's decision-making, right? But anyone you talk to, whether they're in the NFL or played in the NFL or whatever, the number one reason teams go to the combine, it's to talk to these players and have them go through the team doctor drills. It's not to watch them do the 40-yard dash at 8:00 at night. You look at the running backs this year, no running back tested in the 3-cone. Some people thought that they opted out or whatever. It was 12:30 when they were ready to do the 3 cones. And it's like, that's too late. We're not going to ask players to do it. They've been up for 19 hours. So I do think that the combine has to change. If it's going to be prioritized to the event, it's going to be.
Yeah. And moving on from the combine and pushing towards kind of looking towards the draft. I know that's one of the big markers on your show is tackling the draft and everything. And one of the big questions, one of the bigger pieces of analysis I always hear when moving towards the draft is, why would you draft blank in the first when you could draft some of these players later on? Yeah. So like blank versus blank. So I was curious, who are some players on the draft board right now who you would say, why would you draft this player early on when you could go and draft someone else in the second, third, fourth? Because I think there's a lot of that in this draft class. I think this draft class we moved away from there being, last year, this really, really high end tier prospects early on. And there are a lot of those prospects here in this draft, but it feels like this draft is has a lot more depth when you move down. It feels like there's 20 wide receivers who can go in the first 2 days easily. Yeah. So it seems like there's a lot of depth here.
I think, certain positions where I think that will come up, I think is, defensive tackle. I think Jordan Davis is a phenomenal player. I think he's going to go inside the first 16, 15 picks. But if you're going to tell me you can get Jordan Davis, say, in the top 10 versus Travis Jones of UConn, the other defensive tackle there, say, in the top of the second round, I'm choosing Travis Jones. As good as Jordan Davis is, I think Travis Jones is also going to be a phenomenal player. And I think it's some of the smaller receivers, right, like Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, who I really like as prospects, comparing them to guys that you can get on day two, like Sky Moore of Western Michigan, or maybe not Calvin Austin Jr. of Memphis. He is very small, but Jahan Dotson of Penn State, right? Like, I think you want to covet rare size, and I think I'm going to emphasize size, rare size, athleticism combinations in the first round. And that's what Jordan Davis is, right? But Travis Jones is very similar in terms of athlete. He's not the athlete that Davis is, but still a very special athlete. With Olave and Wilson, I do have concerns with the size, right? It's tough to win in the NFL like 185 pounds, right? You're going to have to create some free releases for him and stuff like that. So I do think I have concerns there. Whereas Drake London, like, you're not getting a Drake London on day two. Like, you won't. There's no Drake London on day two this year. Even though there are some bigger receivers, I think I lean into him more as just like top 10 caliber player. Linebacker's another one. You know, Devin Lloyd in round one. If you're telling me you have to draft him in the top 15, I think this year it's really deep. Chad Muma of Wyoming, Brandon Smith of Penn State, even Christian Harris of Alabama, I think, or Darian Beavers of Cincinnati. There are a lot of other linebackers that if you told me you can get these guys on day two, day three, I'd probably lean that direction. And guess what's showing up? I mentioned defensive tackle and I mentioned off-ball line. It's just the positional value component of it, right? It's like, as good as this player could be at this position, I know what's more important. I need to draft edge talent, offensive tackle talent, cornerback talent, receiver talent early in these rounds, because it's more important to be elite at those positions than it is to be complete or average at those positions, right? Interior offensive line, you can get away with, average to above average starters. Same with on the interior, same with that off-ball linebacker. Where you need to have eliteness, you can't afford average or completeness, is the receiver position and probably, the offensive tackle position. I think that's where you want to win there. Yeah,
absolutely. Absolutely. When I first wrote this topic, the first team, I'm obviously a Packers fan. Like, they're, with how deep the wide receiver core or the wide receiver class is looking, like, it seems like from now till the end of time, we're going to have 20 wide receivers in every class who's going to be good in the NFL. It feels like we haven't gotten just a bust wide receiver class in a while. And it seems like a lot of those deeper positions that are still those really high value positions are going to be really interesting in the NFL moving forward, and how these teams opt to approach it. Because it feels like you can get these players at these high value positions. And there's always, wide receiver is probably the one I always see the most, where it's, why would you go out and draft some of these higher end players when you could get them in the second, third round? And we see it bearing itself out the opposite direction. I mean, look last year when you could have taken Jamar Chase earlier on, or you could have taken Penei Sewell in their situation and went and gotten a bunch of day two, day three wide receivers. Like, it's a really interesting conversation topic I see with how the NFL is changing.
I do feel that with, some of the recency of like 20 receivers coming off the board, 50 picks and stuff, it's just you're playing more receivers, right? Like, more teams are running 11 personnel. I mean, a lot of teams are even running 10 personnel, right? Like, even your tight ends have to be glorified receivers. More teams are running, there are three. You have three starting receivers now, right? Like, the 11 personnel is the most common personnel, and 10 personnel is also run a decent amount by some of these teams. I think that's probably the biggest reason why. I think 10 years ago, you're not running 11 personnel as your primary package, right? You're running more 2 running back or only 2 wide receiver, 2 tight end type of set. So I think now that a slot receiver is a starter, you're more often looking for now 3 starters at that position. And you need that 4th player for rotational depth, because you need all that stuff. So you play a lot of receivers, whereas other positions, right, you're not rotating in guys out and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more thing before sticking with the draft, before we get you out of here. I thought of this segment and it made me laugh, so I figured I'd sneak it in here. It's so easy to give players a tagline in the draft. Like, there's so many common ones: generational, workhorse, yada, yada, yada. What's one that you think just gets overused nowadays, and a player that's gained overused on in the draft right now? Like, I think one of the biggest ones for me is workhorse. Mm-hmm. Like, it seems like every now and then there's this running back that comes out and everyone's like, he's a workhorse. He can handle that really heavy workload. And I mean, how many teams in the NFL nowadays are still using that workhorse, like, single running back? Like, it's,
I think the one that comes to mind for me, and I think it's very similar to yours, is just 3 down back, right? Like, I'm a 3 down back. I'm a 3 down back. Like, who even runs 3 down backs anymore? Like, Derrick Henry is like the only actual 3 down back. You could look at even Christian McCaffrey is, sometimes not playing all 3 downs. Alvin Kamara is not playing all 3 downs sometimes. Like, teams are craving freshness at that position more than anything. So, like, being this 3 down back just doesn't have the value. I don't want a 3 down back. I want a guy that can come in for one or two downs and be spectacular in those downs. Right? I want a spectacular pass catching back. And I want a guy that wins on short yardage, and I want a guy that can win on early downs that has the juice to hit the home run. Like, that's what you have to covet. You need to build your, everyone has this trope of build your receiving core like a basketball team. You need to build your backfield like a basketball team. You need all these different skill sets. You need to throw all these different things out. I don't want the same guy running through the hole on all three downs. I want the team to be, I want teams to be more interested in adding these different guys, adding different skill sets at that position. I think other tropes generational talent is one that gets thrown around probably too often. I think high motor, gets thrown around too much. And I think it's also like thrown around whenever you want it. Like you'll probably call any player in this draft a high motor player. Like honestly, you probably call any player in this draft a high motor player. I think also one that I'm kind of moving away from is like freak. I think freak. I think half this draft class has been called a freak at one way or another. I think it's probably an overused term. I think we need to start, maybe choosing better language there and getting better in that regard too.
That's the 1% of athletes make it in the NFL. They're all kind of freaks compared to
everyone's a freak. Everyone's an athlete.
Tim at the water cooler from accounting, I don't think is going to really fit that description. Look, we know you're a very busy person and you got to get out of here. Tons of breaking news that come by. One thing we do like to ask our guests that managed to pop in about their favorite moments. What was your favorite moment from 2021 that comes to mind right away?
Man, that's tough. I do think that that game between the Raiders and Chargers, that season finale, I think was one of the more incredible games of the year. I think that I'm also from Oakland. I'm a big Raiders fan growing up. So seeing the Raiders make the playoffs in that final game, I thought that was great.
Yes.
That's so good. Again, we appreciate you so much for finding the time in your busy day to pop on a show with a couple of new faces around town. So again, thank you. Appreciate your work. Love the draft primer. Love everything you guys put out. Honestly, I used to be a naysayer, but I have very much so come around, and I know it's a lot of that's thanks to my man Billy right there. If you have anything on the pipeline that you want to mention to maybe some of our viewers or listeners that don't know, feel free.
Well, definitely go to pff.com. Check out the work that I'm doing there and the rest of the guys are doing there. You can follow me on Twitter at PFF_Austin Gayle. My podcast is Tailgate, wherever you get your podcasts, and continue to listen to this podcast, Full Tilt Dynasty Podcast. I had a lot of fun with you guys. Thank you so much.
That absolutely means a lot. And look, we're back Saturday with the Fantasy Walkabout as we take a spiritual journey through the value on your fantasy rosters that maybe may not be looking so good 3 or 4 years down the road. We're going to help you out with that. I always want to end the show with the same bits of advice. Take care of one another. Be kind to one another. Check in on your loved ones when you need them. Remember that clear eyes and full hearts can never lose, and that your best days, well, they're always spent tilting. Good night, everybody.